Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, one data point, as it happens, for you all this week, and that is 43%, which is the amount by which Tesla's stock price had dropped since the start of the year at some point in late April.
Tesla stock is under pressure following the movement that
Elon Musk's Tesla is now one of the worst performing companies on the S&P 500.
Just this week, the electric vehicle maker started eliminating thousands of job postings.
It's recovered a bit since then, but clearly these are tough times for Tesla. Its car sales have been falling. It's facing intensified competition with Chinese brands. You know, that's hurting sales and hurting profits, and it's led the company to recently lay off around 14,000 employees. That's about 10% of its global workforce, and among those affected were the entirety of its team responsible for its supercharger network. That's the infrastructure that its cars relied on in the United States to get charged. Yeah, so generally, the shift in this car company's fortunes seems symbolic of the general anxiety one senses in the United States, the feeling of falling behind China in critical technologies. So, yeah, we thought we'd dig into the broad economic issues at stake here. But Adam, I thought we could start with specifically the fall in the stock price and the thousands of layoffs. How would you define what's going wrong with Tesla recently? I mean, more generally, I'm curious whether you think these are problems that are characteristic of a kind of industry upstart. Obviously, Tesla is not such an old company. Or rather, are these kind of problems of an industry incumbent? I mean, which of the two is Tesla these days?
It's a great question and a great way into this, I think, because what's fascinating about Tesla is the question of identity, really. And this is a question, you might think of as being psychoanalytic or political in this modern age of identity politics. But in fact, it's the central question in the valuation of Tesla as a company. I mean, Tesla in 2008 was a clear, innovative disruptor, right? It was the company that made electric vehicles chic and proved that they were desirable to affluent Californian customers. That was the Roadster, the breakthrough. We did an episode about this way back. Now, the issue is that it's the bears on Tesla basically see it as an incumbent first mover in a rapidly growing segment of an existing industry, which is, so it's gone from being, this boutique, innovative, out-of-the-box, disruptive purveyor of high-end EVs to being a car company in an industry where all car companies are moving towards various type of hybrid and electric vehicles, so EV for short. And it's just one of those, and it's caught up in that transition. The response by Musk, and this is where the identity thing comes into it, is to say, no, we're not a car company first and foremost. What we basically are is an AI company on wheels. So you get analysts engage in this bizarre rhetoric about, artificial intelligence is looking for its robot body, and the robot body is the car. But if you actually look at the revenue of the company, of its sales, of Tesla's total quarterly sales so far this year, 82%. So that was 21 billion, and 82% of them came from automotive. So the effort is to sort of rebrand it as something that it's not. So the Tesla official line is, no, we're not a car company, believe it or not. But 82% of their business is cars. And if you look at their car business, they look like just another competitor increasingly in an extraordinarily intense, fierce competition for no longer the ultra high end, but the middle market of electric vehicles, of EVs. And so they've come under and are themselves now a major driver of price pressure. They were once a premium producer with very large margins, and the consequence of the competition that has entered this segment across the board is that their average vehicle price has fallen from over $50,000 down to $38,000. Margins are squeezed in the same way, and at the same time, of course, there is huge pressure for them to engage in capex investment to develop new models, to roll out production, to meet demand, and so on. or none of this would be as intense and kind of frenzied and crazed as it is were it not for the extraordinary stock market valuation that the company had attracted. So in its disrupting the car industry mode, it attracted absolutely spectacular valuations. And the worry in the American commentary on this is as much about really the sustainability of those valuations as it is the fate of Tesla as the producer of, decent quality, high performance electric vehicles. I mean, and the numbers here are staggering, right? The price to earnings ratio, so the price that you pay to buy a unit of Tesla stock in relation to the earnings that it generates, is 86. That's this ratio. For VW, which is a plausible comparator in the automotive space, the ratio is 5. So even if, say for sake of argument, we say that Tesla is, as a car maker, 4 times more promising than VW, you'd be at a valuation of 20 as opposed to 5 to 1 in terms of the price to earnings ratio. And that would involve a 75% fall in the value of Tesla's stock. And so this frantic effort to rebrand it essentially as an AI company on wheels by way of the focus on autonomous driving is all about maintaining that gigantic equity premium on which, of course, Elon Musk's wealth, his fame, the entire Tesla Musk phenomenon is based. If he was just the CEO of a VW or marginally better valued car company, we wouldn't be in Musk world in the way that we are. And this frantic effort to innovate, to create new narratives around the company is part of the effort to justify this 20 times higher PE ratio that Tesla enjoys over VW.
So let's try to consider this, purported strategic shift to concentrating on autonomous driving cars. Let's try to take that pivot on its own terms. I'm curious, whether the barriers to the widespread deployment of self-driving cars, what they are at this point. I mean, are they mainly technological, or are there really kind of regulatory barriers holding that up? And, if it ever got to be deployed on a wide scale, I mean, what could be the economic effects of that kind of widespread driverless mobility?
So, I mean, I'm relying here on a really interesting piece that you dug up on Slow Boring, Matty Iglesias' Substack, which has the typically punchy headline, why self-driving cars are underhyped at this moment. And his argument is that we're not really appreciating the extent to which this is a dawning reality. So there are places in the United States, Phoenix, parts of California, San Jose, I gather, where you can already take a ride in a driverless vehicle, in a driverless and autonomous taxi, and they're fully licensed and operative. And so this is a technology which is arriving. But what he then asks himself is, why is it not catching on more spectacularly than it is? And this is where this balance of technological development and regulation comes in, because so far, he points out, that the technology exists. And if you were just in it for the thrill, you could get into one of these vehicles. There's just no point, because none of them so far are licensed for use on the freeway. In other words, motorways, high-speed roads. And so there's an interesting balance here, which is what you would want. Presumably these vehicles are going to be used extensively for things like trips to the airport or whatever. And if you can't get on the freeway, then you're basically wasting your time using one of these vehicles. You're doing it for the kicks. I think the rationalization of this is that the regulatory authorities quite sensibly take the view that they should force the people wanting to roll out these Waymo vehicles. If they want to roll out this technology, they have to prove it in an environment which is low speed and very complex. And that would be ordinary urban streets. The thing about freeways, about motorways, as anyone who's actually driven on them will know, and I vividly remember because I came to driving late in life, is it's terrifying getting on because you have to put your foot down and really go at speed. But on the other hand, once you're on, it's tedious and monotonous in a way that driving in a city street with all sorts of obstructions and folks who aren't sticking by rules is not. And so right now we're in this sort of space where the technologies are being trialed in inherently more difficult environments with a view to testing their reliability before putting them on the road. Iglesias also makes the point that there is a huge regulatory bias here, which is that we are testing autonomous driving against an incumbent technology which is frankly lethally dangerous and thoroughly unreliable, which is human-driven vehicles. Which if we, were simply trying to minimize road death, we would move much more rapidly towards autonomous driving. But it's clear that the idea of somebody being killed or run over by a robot-driven vehicle is it's sort of culturally unacceptable in the way that being killed or driven by a careless, drunk, or just plain stupid driver, somehow we've socialized that. And so we need to make a mind shift. The fascinating point he goes on to make is, and this is part of a sort of broader liberal concern in the United States about the rigidity of American society, just how much difference will this make? And his argument is that, well, railways and the shift to railways and then away from railways to motor vehicles made huge differences to American society, precisely because around them, American society was, for better or many of us believe, very much the worse, remodeled. So America's cities agglomerated around the railway, and then as the railway was more or less forcibly, literally in some cases, torn up and replaced by motor vehicles, America dispersed into this ghastly suburban sprawl within which it continues to this day. I mean, America is not a society with lots of big cities. Most cities in the United States are sprawling suburban spaces, and this is organized around the motor vehicle. And Iglesias, like so many other American liberals, is obsessed with this problem of NIMBYism, and his argument is essentially that both from the labor side and from the side of construction, even if it's true that autonomous vehicles are, and this is from a European point of view, the astonishing thing, it's like Americans discover through autonomous vehicles the promise of, guess what, drum roll, a bus. Or guess what, drum roll, a subway. A subway is a vehicle in which one driver drives through 1,000 people, right? It's incredibly efficient. He's not or she's not a robot, but they might as well be because they're on rails. And in some ways, it would be a more efficient way of doing this. But the crucial thing is it's one person driving 1,000 people. And essentially, this is what autonomous vehicles will enable America to do. The question is, because Americans hate public transport, is there sufficient dynamism and flexibility in American society to enable it to adjust to the benefits that autonomous driving could produce, which could include like a fundamental reconfiguration of urban space because you wouldn't need parking in the same way? Will people actually be willing to use shared vehicles? Could we see a restructuring of both the labor market and the city space? And Iglesias is, as you like, a tech optimist and a social pessimist and a political pessimist in saying, yes, this technology is dramatic, we're underselling it, but what we may be underrating is, if you like, the ossification, the sclerotic nature of American society today, which might not really even enable it to have the pervasive socially transformative effects that earlier generations of technology did. And this is a key point also in the difference between the US and China, because clearly one of the things about the rapid absorption of EVs in China is not a society that was previously motorized. So they are shifting to EV as they motorize. And it's a society previously extraordinarily heavily reliant on public transport and mass transit urban infrastructure. And so the American mix is singular. And though America may be leading in this technological space to a degree, on the AI side anyway, that's, I think, the real open question, is how far is society and its political economy ready to absorb this shock in a creative and productive way?
Yeah, what's clearly not in dispute is that electric cars have a much higher market share in China. I think the statistics I saw were that 30% or so of new car sales in China are electric cars. And, compared with Europe or the United States, the figures are much lower and they're declining. I think, in the single digits in the US and maybe up to 10% in Europe or so. So yeah, a huge difference there. And I'm curious, what are the factors that have contributed to that success in China? I mean, are there disincentives explicitly for gas-powered cars? Has direct government investment, helped lower prices of electric cars? Or is it maybe the infrastructure for electric charging? Is that just substantially better? And if that's the case, then who's responsible for that infrastructure? I mentioned the supercharging infrastructure that Tesla's now pulling out of. That's a kind of private effort. I mean, is there a sort of a difference there in how China's approached that question?
So yes, China is really the driver of this technological shift. And it's important, I think, to note this, that this, along with solar power and wind, is an area where China is really leading the world in modernization. There are certain European societies with very, very high rates of EV adoption, but they're tiny by comparison, whereas China is the largest vehicle market in the world, 26 to 30 million units, depending on how you count it. It's absolutely gigantic. It decides the future of the global industry, certainly the globally active players, not the Fords, which are largely parochial North American firms at this point, but players like Toyota or VW or Hyundai are all essentially focused on the Chinese market. And in China, between 2020 and 2023, and the story is moving so fast that the numbers are rapidly rendered out of date, but in that period anyway, that 4-year period, 2020 to 2023, the EV production, electric vehicle production in China rose from 1 million to 6 million. So last year, and the figures are literally changing by the month, by the day, last year, EV sales were about 26% of 25% of the Chinese market. The figure will be even larger this year. And it's important, the chronology is significant here, right? Because we think of 2020 to 2021, 22 as COVID time, kind of a paralysis of the Western economies. And we think of China as somehow having also suffered some terrible lockdown. But this is a misunderstanding, right? The Chinese economy was locked down early in 2020 and then actually rapidly grew for the rest of 2020 and 2021. And one of the leading sectors that we just weren't paying any attention to. So it really caught the West by surprise when it exploded onto global markets in 2023 was this growth in Chinese electric vehicle production. So whilst we were obsessing about face masks and vaccinations, the Chinese were pushing really hard into this pioneering new space. And a key element of this is subsidy. So what element of this is market size? It's always easier to innovate when you've got a big, relatively homogeneous market, which the Chinese have, and a market which isn't deeply entrenched in internal combustion engines, right? So the Chinese don't have a long tradition of domestic internal combustion production. They bought Toyotas, they bought BMWs for a time. They also bought GMs, General Motors vehicles. But it's not a big wrench for the Chinese, unlike for the Europeans and the Americans, to transition to driving electric vehicles. So it's a big market which is uniform and relatively easy to shift. And it was also a market that was very heavily subsidized. The very latest package is a IRA, Inflation Reduction Act kind of scale package, which the Chinese government rolled out end of last year, 520 billion yuan, so that's like $72 billion. That's the largest single package they've done. But they've had 10 years of various types of tax-based subsidy on the one hand, and disincentives you were mentioning for internal combustion engines. The key thing in China is whether you can get a license plate, the permission to actually drive the vehicle in urban areas. Many local governments really crack down on the issue of internal combustion licensing plates. They have massive pollution problems. And the scale of the Chinese subsidies per vehicle is significant. Again, it's kind of similar to the levels of spending here. So, roughly $4,000 US per vehicle, something in that kind of ballpark. So significant subsidies from the government to consumers to drive this transition for 10 years, and a resolute and firm commitment by the government to doing this. So you don't have to worry if you buy one of these in China, unlike in the US, that there'll be an election and the government will change and then you'll have a White House that is determined to actually roll back the subsidies. Not happening in China. There's a credible commitment to this transition, which has now acquired huge scale. But it's important, I think, to when we think about China, not to fall into sort of stereotypical traps. One is it's this giant uniform space, they're all the same, which is just sort of ethnocentric stereotyping and absurd. And the other one is that the Chinese economy is essentially a creature of subsidy. The Chinese miracle can only really be understood if you recognize the combination of the large, relatively uniform market, the very significant industrial policy subsidies, and then, and this is the crucial bit, hugely innovative, massively competitive, creative destruction, which within what is broadly speaking a hands-off, publicly subsidized, but largely autonomous and private sector, which is what we've seen in the motor vehicle industry. So they started out with, over 100 producers, have whittled this down to about a dozen. There's bankruptcies across the board. And what you're left with then is a champion group of producers. The two leading ones are BYD and Geely. And Geely is on the same level of Tesla in the Chinese market, about 150,000 units per quarter. BYD is off in a space all of its own. BYD is producing electric vehicles at a scale which no one else is doing. They're selling 600 to 700,000 units per per quarter. These are gigantic sales. The other thing they're doing is partnering with local government in a very effective way to build out charging infrastructure and figure out operational solutions. So if you're going to have a taxi fleet and you need the cars to run for extended shifts, how do you figure out the charging infrastructure so that the taxis all arrive to charge at points in the electricity cycle over the pattern of the day where more and less power is used, such that you can plug a whole bunch of taxis in a city onto the grid at a moment when there's abundant electricity and you don't blow the fuses in the entire system. And then the third thing the Chinese companies, of course, now are globally notorious for having done is just rigorous, absolute systematic focus on batteries. We already mentioned this with BYD and Geely, but this is the key technology. They recognized this extremely early on in the same way as Ford recognized that mass manufacturing internal combustion engines is really the key to mass production, because machining internal combustion engines is very difficult. With electric vehicles, the engines are much easier to make. The technology you have to master is powerful, long duration, light batteries. And this is where the Chinese focused. Of course, they also had the rare earth supplies in China. So it's this combination of factors. If we were asking how it is that China became the dominant global electric vehicle force that it is, it's the market, it's government subsidy, it's huge, fierce competition, and it's key innovative strategies which have put them in the very commanding place they're currently in. This means the payoff from this is that Chinese electric vehicles, whether you're talking about the cheapest entry-level models, which are $10,000 to $20,000, or fancier SUVs, which in the Chinese case are around $30,000, are tens of thousands of dollars cheaper than their Western equivalents. And the Chinese can even begin to supply electric vehicles, notably scooters, into emerging market and low-income markets in the rest of Asia. And so they're covering a much greater bandwidth of technology and technological options in this transition than the flagship Western company, Tesla, which is essentially selling very high-end vehicles to suburban consumers in affluent California.
Okay, we're going to take a break right here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about Tesla. So I'm curious then what China's relationship to Tesla and, Elon Musk, its CEO, has been like. I mean, are Teslas at all competitive with Chinese cars? If we, control for maybe some of those investments and subsidies that you were referring to. I mean, Western companies often complain in different sectors that the Chinese state is involved in market distorting practices of various kinds, sometimes of outright, stealing technologies in various ways. Has that been the case at all with electric vehicles?
Well, I mean, Tesla's relationship with the Chinese regime has hitherto been extremely cozy, and Musk's, sudden visit to China in recent weeks and the very high level entry that he was granted there, compared to, for instance, his slighting of India, where he was announced as a visitor and then never showed up, I think gives you an idea of quite how cozy this relationship is. Tesla and Apple are the two US flagship companies, both branded as tech businesses, which have the closest relationships with the Chinese hierarchy and whose business models incredibly heavily depend on China. China is Tesla's biggest market outside the US. It's a vital part of its global supply chain. Musk did a deal in 2018 with Li Chang, who was at the time Communist Party boss in Shanghai, and he's now Xi's prime minister in the current iteration of Xi's regime. They agreed to build this giant multi-billion-dollar EV factory outside in the outskirts of the city. It's an investment which really pioneers and helps drive the Chinese development, because you put a very high-end Western producer in the Chinese market, attracting the most affluent Chinese consumers, and then behind and in the space left by Tesla's high-end market niche strategy, the Chinese companies enter in and supply a more mass market, more middle and lower middle class audience. I never had seen as many Teslas as I did in Hong Kong when I visited there last year. I was used to seeing Teslas around streets in the West, but in Hong Kong, they just seemed like the standard choice of all upper middle class, affluent local Chinese consumers. So Tesla was very important in breaking this open. There's another big, of course, American play in this market, and that's Warren Buffett, who has been a long-standing backer of BYD. So there's American capital on both sides of this business. The BYD story is just too great for Western investors, long-term investors to ignore. And maybe it's something we should maybe do an episode about, because it's such a dramatic story. The fascinating thing about the long-term development here is, as in the case of Apple, if we take Musk at his word, Tesla is, after all, an AI business. It's not a car business. It's kind of like it's a terrifying form of AI, because it's AI that drives around, and Tesla vehicles don't have sensors; they have cameras in them. And so the Chinese have actually had very serious reservations about allowing Tesla access to the kind of artificial intelligence GPS mapping technology that it needs for its vehicles to operate autonomously in China. So we tend to focus in the West on Chinese spying on us, but from the Chinese point of view, this is an American vehicle driving around with a bunch of cameras in it, which apparently is going to lock into China's, most comprehensive GPS databases. And a crucial element in the business model for Tesla going forward in China is that they've been able to do a tie-up with Baidu, which is the data gatekeeper in China, and they've been able to persuade China's data protection officers. And we're tempted to sort of smirk and go, China has data protection officers? It really, really does. And they matter to a very considerable extent, because they do, in fact, protect consumer rights and have forced some very uncomfortable deals on the big platforms in China in the interests of greater competition, which the Chinese favor as a model of industrial policy. But of course, there's also secretive, high-tech information here, which is being shared by the Chinese and their software giants and their platforms with an American business. Which is, a reverse flow of information. And if you add into this, of course, that Musk, with his other hats on, is SpaceX, and SpaceX, given NASA's essentially default on developing heavy lift vehicles, or its incredibly slow development of them, is essentially the key supplier of heavy lift capacity, amongst other things, to America's Space Force. In other words, a key element of the, Donald Trump founded new branch of the American military, which takes America's military capacity into space. I mean, Elon Musk is like a walking, talking security hazard, basically, wandering around China at any given time. And he must be amongst the people with the highest levels of security clearance to visit China quasi in a private capacity at this point. I mean, no doubt Tim Cook, as head of Apple, has immense levels of, insight into American tech, but Musk, is essentially the living and kicking most dynamic element of America's space program. And the guy, he's a force unto himself and flies himself around the world in an extraordinary extent. It's not obvious, I think, how this balance is going to play out and whether this model is survivable. What I gather insiders talk about is basically building a series of firewalls such that Tesla autonomous vehicles in China do not share sensitive Chinese data with the Western business. So the cameras that just drive around on Chinese streets on Tesla cars will not pass that information back to databases the NSA can easily hack. What I think is the kind of deal that the Chinese and that Tesla will desperately need in its Chinese market if it's going to go the autonomous driving route.
Yeah, so I mean, to some extent, I guess that leads to my last question, which is, admittedly a pretty abstract one, but I'm curious whether you think we'll remember Elon Musk as a Henry Ford-like figure, as the person who made the vision of mass market e-cars into a reality, or not. I mean, will there be some other figure, a Chinese figure, who will fill that role, or more generally, is kind of individual celebrity at all a useful lens through which to be, thinking about the process of innovation and entrepreneurial creativity that's involved in this kind of, major industrial shift?
I mean, I think in general, it's quite clear that both on the Chinese side, on the American side, the EV revolution, and to a degree also in Europe, is a collective process. It's certainly not the result, doesn't spring, from the brain of Elon Musk. It's an ecosystem, and he's actually had to fight a lawsuit to get himself recognized as a co-founder even of the business, because unlike Ford, he didn't found Tesla just as his own business, right? He has had to actually claim founder rights by way of an expensive lawsuit. In the Chinese case, it's quite clear that the success of those firms, not to deny individual agency, again a bad prejudice, but is clearly an ecosystem effect. It's the fact that they have this network of producing firms that are able to link together and tie together. But it is like, let's allow ourselves this historical caprice of thinking of Ford and Musk in the same frame. I mean, I think the way to think of them is less as an iteration or a repeat, but more like bookends, right? So Ford initiated the beginning of the internal combustion engine mass revolution, and Tesla, you could, I think, reasonably claim initiates its end in the sense that it points forward to a new future. And if you look at the business press, there's a bunch of other slightly less flattering comparisons being drawn. Both of them had kooky politics. In Elon Musk's case is, one has to say, sort of ambiguous and a little hard to define, an extreme tolerance for right-wing opinion that's very disagreeable. In Henry Ford's case, just an out-and-out conspiratorial anti-Semitism. He's one of the main channels through which the infamous, poisonous Protocols of the Elders of Zion made its way into the Anglosphere. He bought a newspaper, like Musk, bought Twitter. And you could also say, and this is where, the backbiting really starts, that they may also be instances of the way in which distraction in senior corporate leadership leads ultimately to corporate failure. Ford bestrode the world in the 1920s. About half the world's cars in the early 1920s were Model Ts. By 1929, Ford had been outflanked by GM. Ford was spending his time worrying about hydroelectric power, airplane manufacturing, projects in Central America and Latin America. Whilst Alfred P. Sloan and General Motors, actually became the dominant US firm. And you could see a sort of similar story between Tesla and BYD, if you like, playing out here. Ford was really rescued by his grandson and by the demand of World War II that shifted the company. But I think the more important point to focus on is the car-making business and the political economy of this, because there's a fundamental difference between the two men in this respect. And it's very telling about the different epochs that we are in. I mean, Ford didn't invent the car or demonstrate to people that it was in the internal combustion engine was superior to horses. What Ford did was to find out a way of making them very, very efficiently and therefore cheap. And that's really the key innovation of the Ford era. That's not the same with Musk, right? Musk is a man who basically broke open the imagination of the world. But the product that he created in the first generation of Teslas is an extremely high-end vehicle, sold on larger scale than before, because the market of affluence is large in the United States today. But it was never a play on low price, whereas Ford was driving always towards the lowest possible price for his vehicles. Huge gap. I mean, the Model T Ford in the early 20s, in modern day money, it was about $260 at the time. In modern day money, that's about $4,400. So even allowing for inflation, it was a cheap vehicle. Teslas have always been towards the high end of the medium to high end car market, right? Very, very different offering. Ford was able to do this because his production lines and the techniques that were deployed were so efficient. We could do a whole episode about the actual underlying logic. It's quite interesting. It isn't just simply the assembly line. But the other thing that Ford did was to combine this with a very high rate of pay to compensate workers for the extreme stresses of the new production system. Famously, in early 1914, Henry Ford introduced the $5 day for an 8-hour day, 6-day week. This suddenly created a newly affluent American working class. It's the origin of the conflation and confusion in American discourse of the working class with the middle class, because somebody working in a Ford factory could buy a Ford car in a matter of months from their salary, right? And so over the course of the year, if you were crazy and not doing anything else, you could afford several cars whilst earning a Ford salary. Tesla's model is completely different. So Tesla's model cars are expensive and its workers are non-unionized and are paid below UAW rates. Now, Ford was a dogged anti-union man, but the way in which he kept his plants union clear was actually to pay outlandish, at the time, fantastical wage rates. No one had ever earned this kind of money before. Tesla's deal is much more, as he says, hardcore, right? You either want the job or you don't, and you take it on his terms. And it's been an extraordinary shock to Tesla to discover that there are highly sophisticated places in Europe in which you simply can't do business like that. Tesla in Sweden right now is paralyzed by a mass of sympathy strikes, which mean that, for instance, people won't deliver mail to Tesla showrooms in Sweden, and therefore they can't get the license plates to put on the cars because the postal union is striking in solidarity with the metalworkers union that wants the mechanics in Tesla garages in Sweden to be unionized. Massive ongoing struggles about the unionization of Tesla's plants in Germany as well. Will Tesla ever shift to a Ford model? Two elements would have to shift. Elon Musk would have to change his views about trade unions. I think that's extremely unlikely to happen. But the real question, I think, on everyone's mind is, does Tesla have a value play? Does Tesla have a budget model car in its development pipeline? And frankly, we just don't have clarity about this. And part of the obfuscatory talk about Tesla as an AI company and as anything other than a car company is really to avoid the question of what car are you going to make next? And if we look at where Elon's mind is at, and there is an entire subgenre of market analysts who spend their time trying to figure out what this scatterbrained person is actually focused on, it's just not clear that there is, the famous budget Tesla in the works. The things which the boss seems to be mainly focused on are the Cybertruck and things like this, which are selling at very modest rates, 1,000 units a month, priced at $60,000 and up. It's not clear here that we have a CEO or a business that is squarely focused on anything even remotely like the Ford model of becoming the driver of a really mass market in these vehicles. An affluent market, sure, but a mass market, it's just not clear that they have the desire, the interest, or even the potential to go there. And the worry, of course, is that the Chinese are already there and on a huge scale, and Musk knows it, which is, I think, what's driving this kind of panicked rush up the value scale and out of the retailing of cars. Ford, meanwhile, has given up on selling sedans altogether. It doesn't sell regular cars. It doesn't sell either estate, or all it sells is trucks nowadays. And it's having a very hard time offloading, its gigantic, much ballyhooed. We talked about it on the show. The Lightning, the Ford F-150 electric version, is not selling well at all. So though their plans are to move into the electric space, it's not sure that either of them will really be an American success story 10 years from now.
So, yeah, I wonder if the more apt analogy is less with Henry Ford than with Steve Jobs as the entrepreneur who created the iPhone, which is also a high-end product.
I think that is absolutely the space that this comes out of, and I think if you were, that seems very much the analogy. It's a kind of Californian model of the future in that sense.
Okay, well, we do need to wrap up this conversation here for now, but we will be back next week as always. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.